again, I'll be focusing more narrowly on specifically on the impact of legalization and commercialization in communities of color and the intersection with social justice. But I think there will be some things that will broadly apply just across legalization as well. And since we just have 10 minutes, I am going to be going through this faster than I might ordinarily go through it. So when it comes to marijuana legalization, there's three core arguments. And actually, before I get that, just for anyone that's not aware of the organization that I work with, SAM, here, I'll say we're a bipartisan national organization, and we work on issues of marijuana policy at the local and federal level. We provide education as well as working with legislators. Our goal really is to see marijuana policy move forward in a way between the extremes of incarceration and arrests on one hand. I think we all are aware of some of the harms of just treating substance abuse as a criminal justice issue. But we're also want to avoid the extremes of commercialization on the other hand. And so we're navigating that space in between that in ways that can move marijuana policy forward in a way that doesn't negatively impact public health. So back to these three core arguments, and that's arrest and incarceration, business equity initiatives, and reinvesting in communities harmed by war and drugs. Those are the most common topics that I've heard in this space. Again, specifically when we're talking about issues of social justice and marijuana legalization. So I want to analyze these things really quickly, just give a bird's eye view of what's going on in this space, and again, things that we can look out for in the future. I think it's really important, though, to start out to remember our past. And not that long ago, in all of our lifetimes, in the 90s, executives from Big Tobacco, from R.J. Reynolds, said stuff like, "We don't smoke that shit. We just sell it. We reserve the right to smoke for the young, the poor, the Black, and the stupid." That was their explicit marketing tactics in our lifetimes. And so we have to be very aware, because one of the questions that I often pose people, actually, that I always pose people, and why I have this slide up is, why do we think things will magically change if these same companies are just selling a different product, right? And so here you see in these slides, and again, if you do not remember anything else that I say in this presentation, if the rest is kind of boring and droning on, I hope you remember this slide and this question sticks in your mind. But you see here in this, that's me and my daughter actually a couple of summers ago. Now I went to get her some ice cream at the nearest convenience store to us. And this is what it looks like in 2022. The closest store where I lived at the time, and when I began working on this issue, the closest store to my house in any direction was a liquor store. And so I think we need to think honestly, if these companies that you see here and the pictures behind me are now just selling a different product, why do we believe that they will that anything will change in terms of how they market, who they target, and who has the most negative health impacts from these addictive products? And so we're seeing a lot of similarities between the tobacco and alcohol industries. We're seeing investments from big tobacco industries over nearly $2 billion from Altria, which is the parent company of Philip Morris. We've seen investments from the alcohol industry, so Molson Coors, Corona, Blue Moon, Heineken, and others. Again, and this is a very lucrative industry. The Washington Post said that it could bring in more than the NFL if it's legalized at the national level. And so to me, what I see taking place, and how it appears to me, is that issues of injustice are being appropriated by corporations and by businesses that are looking for a way to change laws so that they can, for their profit. And so, just as an example, this was the campaign that was ran in DC that said legalization ends discrimination. And I always say, if you think that the systemic issues of discrimination and inequality in our country or your state are going to be solved simply by creating a new lucrative industry, you have a naive and very shallow at best understanding of the depth of these issues in the United States and how they persist still in 2022. And in many ways, we see the history repeating itself. Again, tobacco companies that not that long ago were partnering with organizations in minority communities In this quote from Brown and Williamson, tobacco company, is really insightful. It said, clearly the sole reason for B&W's interest in the Black and Hispanic communities is the actual and potential sales of B&W products within these communities and the profitability of these sales. This relatively small and often tightly knit minority community can work to B&W's marketing advantage if exploited properly. And I will repeat that last line, if exploited properly. That's what these companies are doing. And they're on the right where you see PAC's Marijuana Policy Project and Houseplant making the same types of partnerships, inroads in minority communities that tobacco companies did in the past. And this is important, again, if you're a brand like PAX or Houseplant or whatnot, you want to have that instant name recognition, that instant brand recognition in the community with your product. And so we're seeing, again, some of the same patterns take place, unfortunately. These are just some quick images. On the left, you see Big D Liquors and Benning Heights Market. Those were, again, when I began working on this issue, some of the actually the closest stores to my house. And on the right, we see, some marijuana related businesses in Colorado. Looks eerily similar to me, but more importantly, I think, is the placement. More importantly, to be aware of is the placement. They're disproportionately located in communities of color. One pot shop for every 47 residents in Denver, Colorado, more pot shops than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. And so I say, just to paint that picture, imagine you're walking down the road, you see a McDonald's or a Starbucks, replace that with a dispensary, add some more, and that's the level of saturation that we're talking about, particularly in minority communities. I want to give just, again, a bird's eye view of what's happening in terms of arrest and incarceration in the other two topics. So even the ACLU found that extreme racial disparities in marijuana arrests persist even in legalized or decriminalized states. And what we're seeing is that even though there have been reductions in certain categories of marijuana arrests, very specific categories of marijuana related arrests, the overall rate of arrests of African Americans in Colorado, Denver, and in other states as well has remained unchanged or even gone up in these states since then. And again, to me, this is because there's a systemic underlying issue that is not being addressed. And even if marijuana is legal, if you haven't dealt with those underlying issues, holding people that enforce the law with bias accountable, holding those departments accountable, then you're going to have the same issues pop up in just a different excuse. Maybe they'll say, well, it's legal, but you have too much on your person, or you're using it in a place where you shouldn't, or there's a whole host of excuses. And I don't want to paint law enforcement with a broad brush either and say that all of them, enforce the law with bias. But for those that do, they should be held accountable. Legalization does not hold them accountable. And so we see persistent, if not increased, bias in arrests, depending on, there's multiple ways to interpret this data, but we can just say, again, overall arrests increased. Certain on-view arrests were more likely in Colorado in the years following legalization for Blacks than prior to legalization. The juvenile arrest rate, this is very important, school to prison pipeline, because it's still illegal under the age of 21. Minority youth, according to the data, best available data that was from the Colorado Division of Criminal Justice, saw that there was actually, while it did actually drop a small bit for white youth, I think 5%, it increased 35% for Latino youth and 54% for Black youth. So just things we got to be aware of moving forward. Adult arrests, kind of already touched on that. And again, I'm not going to dig through all these numbers, but just to show we're tracking them, we're talking about them, and the trends are that even after legalization, that there is no significant decrease in arrests, in Black arrests. In Massachusetts here, you see a decrease after 2020. That's when COVID hit. So every state across the board saw significant reductions in arrests after when COVID hit. And the same story with the incarcerated population. I know in DC, our prison population was decreasing for several years prior to legalization. Same thing in Colorado. And then for some reason, after legalization, that decrease changed to an increase. I don't have time to fully break down this slide, but just to say there is no state that post legalization in the years following legalization saw any significant reduction in their prison populations, while, and this is what the second dotted lines are, there actually were some significant reductions in prison populations on legislation that was passed that was actually specifically narrowly targeted at criminal justice reform. So it's an interesting contrast there, and why, in my opinion, marijuana legalization is stealing the oxygen from the room from greater reforms that could be done in this space. Just California, again, don't have time to break down what's happening there, but there was if you go back here, there was a small bump, not huge, but in 2017, small bump in their prison population, which was right after they legalized, and then it continued on its prior trajectory. Business equity initiatives, people, I think this quote from the founder of the National Diversity and Inclusion Cannabis Alliance is very insightful. And it says people had dreams and hopes of building generational wealth, and it's done just the opposite. It's ruining lives at this point. Because these promises of equity are not being upheld nationally. It's still less than 4% ownership by African Americans in the cannabis industry. Even within the medical marijuana industry, which has been around a little bit longer, even in places like New Jersey, where it's been there for 10 years, only one license holder was Black. And so there's a lot of concern by people that are excited about legalization, but are seeing, hey, this is actually hurting, not harming. The equity isn't being realized, and people that have made investment, made dreams, and things like that are really just being left out to dry, and it's creating hurt rather than help. One other quote I'll just highlight is, time is really up on selling your business dream as a social justice movement. And this is from the president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. And so then again, you see headline after headline after headline repeating the same story, that the promises, and they sound wonderful. I will be the first to say that these things sound great, but the reality is they're not materializing. The systems of inequality are still in place. And so we're not seeing the promises for equity take place. And then lastly, reinvesting in communities harmed by the war on drugs. Again, great idea. Same kind of concept of, though, I almost call them like campaign promises of legalization, right? And then what actually happens is, the racial wealth gap is actually being compounded, not helped. And just to emphasize that point, I have a very short video from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. And I like, it's less than a minute, and I like sharing this video because again, for our organization, Sam, this is shouldn't be a partisan issue. Sometimes it is, but it shouldn't be. And so we're looking at what people are saying on both sides of the aisle, and then trying to take a step back and say, so what are the overall takeaways that we can have from this? So, she is an advocate for legalization, but even she is saying, hey, this is compounding the racial wealth gap, not helping. So I'm going to play that really quick.
Compounding the racial wealth gap right now, based on who is getting the first mover advantage. According to an industry trade publication, 73% of cannabis executives in Colorado and Washington are male, 81% are white. In the state of Massachusetts, just 3.1% of the marijuana businesses in the state were owned by minorities, and just 2.2% were owned by women. Is this industry representative of the communities that have historically bared the greatest brunt of injustice based on the prohibition of marijuana?
Absolutely not.
It doesn't look like any of the people who are reaping the profits of this are the people who were directly impacted.
That is correct.
And so, again, just wanted to share that to say people on both sides of the aisles are seeing that a lot of these promises aren't panning out. And again, I bring it back to that initial image I showed in question of, why do we think anything's magically going to change just because old corporations are selling a new product? We already know how they operate. We know who they harm the most. And you guys work in prevention. So I think, we just have to be aware of this new frontier moving forward. This is just a personal side. I always tell people kind of what's my why am I motivated to continue working on this issue and be passionate. When a lot of people tell me, they're like, hey, the train's already left the station, why are you saying anything? And for me, it's just important to say what my truth is, to share that. I have that in my family history. That's my great grandfather and great uncle. They were the first to sit in desegregate schools in Washington, D.C. And I draw an interesting contrast. On the right there, you have John Boehner, who's now going to make $24 million if marijuana is legalized at the federal level. And I say, there's not always a big paycheck at the end of the day if you're doing the right thing. Yeah, I know you all working in prevention, you would love it too if your paycheck for working there in the community was $24 million. Unfortunately, we don't always have that paycheck, but the work that you guys are doing is so important, and that's something to be proud of. And that's why I continue to speak out on this issue. So that, I can look back and say, hey, I spoke up, I shared, I did my best to speak the truth as we're moving into this new frontier of marijuana legalization, commercialization. This is again my contact information, so happy to continue the conversation or dig deeper into any of the slides or topics that I went through. I think it went a little bit over, but I hope that was some good information for you all. Thank you.